You haven't really seen Britain until you've seen Wales. Because if you skip this small country, you miss the mountains, castles, coastlines, and ancient culture that most visitors never even realize are there. In this documentary, we'll first uncover the culture, history, and everyday life that make Wales so distinct. Then travel through its most remarkable places to see why it may be Britain's greatest overlooked treasure. And later, one village and one island will make you question whether this is Britain at all. To understand Wales, the first thing to forget is the idea that it is just a corner of Britain. It is small, around 21,000 square kilometers, or just over 8,000 square miles, but it carries a national character much larger than its size. Wales has its own language, its own flag, its own traditions, and a way of life that can feel surprisingly different from the rest of the United Kingdom. And that difference is not something kept only for museums. You see it on road signs, you hear it in schools, in songs, in local conversations, and in simple words like croeso, which means welcome. The Welsh language, or Cymru, is one of Europe's oldest living Celtic languages, and for many people here, it is not just a symbol from the past, it is part of everyday life. That matters, because Wales has spent centuries holding on to what makes it distinct. Kingdoms rose here long before modern Britain existed. Welsh princes fought to defend their territory, and across the country, castles still show how fierce that struggle became. In many countries, castles are rare highlights. In Wales, they are almost part of the landscape itself. More than 600 castle sites have been recorded across the country, and hundreds still stand in some form today. But they were not built simply to look impressive. Many were part of a long struggle between Welsh rulers trying to protect their land and English kings trying to bring Wales under control. After the conquest of Wales in the late 13th century, King Edward I built some of the most powerful fortresses in Europe here, not as romantic monuments, but as military machines. They guarded roads, rivers, towns, and coastlines. They showed who held power. And for the Welsh people, they became stone reminders of resistance, defeat, survival, and memory. But Welsh culture is not only written in stone, it is carried in music, poetry, and public performance. One of the most important cultural events is the Eisteddfod, a festival of Welsh language, music, poetry, and storytelling. For outsiders, it may sound unusual that poetry could still hold national importance. But in Wales, the spoken word has always mattered. To win as a poet or singer here is not just entertainment. It is part of a much older tradition of memory, pride, and belonging. And some traditions are stranger than people expect. In winter, there is an old custom known as the Mari Lwyd. A decorated horse skull is carried from house to house, usually with a small group of singers. At the door, they exchange rhyming verses with the people inside. If the visitors win the contest, they are invited in for food and drink. Life in Wales was also shaped by a landscape that was beautiful, but rarely easy. In the valleys, people did not simply live among the hills, they worked inside them. Coal miners descended underground before sunrise, while slate workers split rock by hand into thin gray sheets that ended up on roofs across Britain and far beyond. In some places, entire towns were squeezed into narrow strips of land between steep slopes because the valleys left little room to grow. Work was physical, dangerous, and often passed from one generation to the next. For many families, the land was not just scenery. It was the thing that fed them, tested them, and sometimes took people from them. That may be why Welsh community life can feel so intense. This is a country famous for male voice choirs, rugby crowds, small-town loyalty, and a kind of emotional pride that can be heard as much as seen. When thousands of Welsh voices sing the national anthem before a rugby match, it does not feel like a performance. It feels like a declaration that this small country is still very much itself. And then there is the food. Simple, local, and tied to working life. Traditional cafwl is a warming stew, often made with lamb and vegetables. Welsh cakes are cooked on a griddle and served warm, sometimes dusted with sugar. Bara Bries is a fruit loaf often made with tea-soaked dried fruit. Laver bread, made from seaweed, connects the cuisine directly to the coast. These are not luxury foods created for tourists. They come from farms, kitchens, coastlines, and families. Even the national symbols tell you something about the country. The leek and daffodil are worn on St. David's Day, the national day of Wales. And the red dragon on the flag gives Wales one of the most striking national symbols in Europe. It is not gentle or decorative. It feels defiant, which suits a country that has spent so much of its history protecting its language, stories, and sense of itself. But the surprise of Wales is not only cultural, it is also physical. For a country this small, the variety of landscape is remarkable. The coastline alone stretches for about 1,400 kilometers, roughly 870 miles, with cliffs, beaches, islands, estuaries, and old harbor communities. Inland, the land rises into mountains and moorland, then drops into green valleys where towns and villages often feel pressed tightly between hills. Wildlife appears in ways many visitors do not expect. Red kites circle above rural valleys. Gray seals gather along remote shores. Dolphins can be seen off parts of the Welsh coast. In summer, seabirds return to cliffs and islands in huge numbers, turning the edges of the country into one of Britain's great wildlife spectacles. And that is the real reason Wales is so easy to underestimate. It is not one simple thing. Not only castles, not only mountains, not only coastline, not only language or legend, it is all of these things packed into a small country that many travelers pass by without fully understanding what they have missed. And now, to see that for ourselves, we begin in the mountains. Snowdonia National Park, known in Welsh as Eryri, is where Wales immediately challenges the usual image of Britain. This is not a landscape of gentle countryside and quiet lanes. It is a mountain region of sharp ridges, deep glacial valleys, old slate quarries, stone walls, sheep farms, and weather that can change before a walker has time to turn back. At its center rises Snowdon, the highest mountain in Wales at 1,085 meters, about 3,560 feet. Some visitors climb from Pennypass or Llanberis, while others take the Snowdon Mountain Railway, which has carried passengers toward the summit since 1896. But the mountain is only part of the story. For generations, people here lived from land that was beautiful but demanding. Farmers kept hardy sheep on steep slopes. Slate workers cut rock from mountainsides and split it into roof tiles that traveled across Britain and beyond. In nearby communities, Welsh was not a museum language. It was spoken at home, at work, in chapels, and in everyday life. That is why Snowdonia feels so important. It is not just scenery, it is Wales in its rawest form. A short drive from these slopes brings the story down from the mountain and into a village built around one of Wales's most famous legends. Beddgelert looks peaceful at first. A stone village where the Glaslyn and Colwyn rivers meet beneath the mountains. But the reason many people remember it is not the scenery. It is a grave. According to legend, Prince Llywelyn returned from hunting and found his baby missing, the cradle overturned and his loyal dog Gelert covered in blood. Thinking the dog had killed his child, he drew his sword and killed it. Only then did he hear the baby crying nearby. Alive beside the body of a wolf, Gelert had fought off. The grave in the village keeps that story alive, although historians believe the tale was likely popularized much later, partly to attract visitors. And that makes Beddgelert even more interesting. It is not just a pretty mountain village. It shows how Wales turns landscape into story, and how a legend can become powerful enough to shape the identity of a real place. Here, the mountains feel close, but the emotion comes from something smaller: loyalty, grief, and a mistake that can never be undone. From this village of legend, the story of Wales becomes harder, larger, and carved into stone by kings. Caernarfon Castle was not built to be charming. It was built to dominate. After Edward I's conquest of Wales in the late 13th century, this fortress became one of the clearest symbols of English power in the country. Construction began in 1283, and everything about it was designed to send a message. The walls were massive. The towers were angular rather than simple and round. The castle stood beside the water, controlling movement, trade, and the surrounding town. But Caernarfon is not just another medieval ruin. Edward I's son, the future Edward II, was born here in 1284, linking the castle to the title Prince of Wales. Centuries later, in 1969, Prince Charles was formally invested here, showing how this place remained connected to power long after its military purpose had faded. For visitors today, the strange thing is how impressive it still feels. You can walk its walls, look across the town, and understand immediately why castles in Wales were never only about defense. They were about control, fear, politics, and identity. Portmeirion is the first place in this journey that makes Wales feel almost impossible to categorize. One moment, you are in North Wales. The next, you are looking at pastel buildings, arches, domes, balconies, and bright walls that feel closer to the Mediterranean than Britain. But this was not an accident. Portmeirion was designed by architect Sir Clough Williams-Ellis, who began building it in 1925 and kept working on it for decades. His idea was unusual: to prove that a beautiful place could be developed without being destroyed. Instead of copying one exact Italian town, he created a kind of theatrical village, using rescued architectural pieces, playful colors, and carefully framed views over the estuary. Every corner seems arranged to surprise you. A staircase, a tower, a painted wall, a sudden view of water and woodland. Llanddwyn Island is one of the most atmospheric places on the coast of Wales because it is not quite an island all the time. At low tide, visitors can walk across the sand from Newborough Beach. At higher tides, the sea begins to reclaim the crossing, and the place feels suddenly more remote. Its story belongs to Saint Dwynwen, the Welsh patron saint of lovers. According to tradition, she was a 5th-century princess whose own love ended in heartbreak, and she later devoted her life to prayer. Her feast day, January 25, is still sometimes celebrated as a Welsh version of Valentine's Day. That gives the ruins here a very different feeling. The remains of St. Dwynwen's Church, the old stone crosses, the dunes, and the White Tower of Suir Mar are not just coastal scenery. They turn the island into a place of tides, grief, devotion, and memory. But the coast of Anglesey has another face, where romance gives way to cliffs, seabirds, and a lighthouse built for ships in real danger. South Stack Lighthouse stands on a small rocky island off Holy Island, separated from the mainland by a narrow channel of rough water. It was first lit in 1809, built to guide ships around a dangerous stretch of coast where fog, wind, and hidden rocks made navigation risky. To reach it, visitors descend hundreds of steps down the cliffside before crossing a bridge to the island. That detail matters, because South Stack is not just a lighthouse you look at from a distance. You feel the height before you arrive. The Atlantic wind hits the cliffs, waves break below, and the building suddenly makes practical sense. This was a warning system at the edge of danger. The cliffs around it are also one of the best wildlife spots in North Wales. Guillemots, razorbills, Kittiwakes, fulmars, and choughs can be seen along the rock faces, and peregrine falcons hunt above the sea. In spring and summer, the cliffs become noisy, crowded, and alive. After these vertical cliffs, the route follows a longer, quieter arm of land, where beaches, villages, and old pilgrim stories stretch toward the Irish Sea. The Llŷn Peninsula reaches out from northwest Wales like a long finger into the Irish Sea, roughly 48 kilometers, about 30 miles from the mainland toward the west. It is quieter than the big mountain areas, but in some ways it feels even more deeply Welsh. This is one of the strongest Welsh-speaking parts of the country, where the language is not just seen on signs, but heard in shops, farms, schools, and ordinary conversations. The peninsula has long been shaped by small communities, fishing, farming, chapels, and weather coming in hard from the Atlantic. For centuries, it also had spiritual importance. Pilgrims traveled toward the far end of the peninsula before crossing to Bardsey Island, once known as the Island of Saints. The Llŷn is not dramatic in one single way. Its power is slower. Coves, headlands, stone cottages, small harbors, and beaches where the mountains still sit on the horizon. Harlech Castle looks dramatic because it was built to be almost impossible to take. It stands on a rocky spur above the coast, with mountains behind it and what was once much closer access to the sea below. When Edward I built it in the late 13th century, that sea access mattered. Supplies could reach the castle by water, even when enemies surrounded it on land. Construction began in 1283, and the design was brutally efficient. A compact fortress with high walls, strong towers, and a gatehouse that turned the entrance into a trap. But Harlech's most famous story came later, during the Wars of the Roses, when Lancastrian defenders held out for years against Yorkist forces. The siege lasted from 1461 to 1468, one of the longest in British history, and later became linked with the famous Welsh song, Men of Harlech. That is what gives the castle its power. It is not just stone on a hill. It is a place where isolation, loyalty, and hunger became part of the legend. Conwy Castle is one of the clearest examples of how Edward I used architecture as a weapon. Built between 1283 and 1287, it was not just a royal fortress. It was part of a completely planned stronghold, with castle walls connected to town walls that still wrap around the historic center today. Those town walls run for about 1.3 kilometers, roughly 0.8 miles, and include more than 20 towers. That matters because Conwy was not only defending a building, it was creating a controlled English settlement in newly conquered territory, with stone walls deciding who belonged inside and who remained outside. Inside the castle, the scale is still striking. 8 massive towers rise above the estuary, and from the battlements, you can see why this position mattered. River, coast, road, and mountain route all meet here. For Edward I, Conwy was a lock on North Wales. And from this world of kings and fortresses, Wales moves into another kind of ambition, not defending land, but carrying water across the sky. Pontcysyllte Aqueduct is one of those places that sounds impossible until you see it. A narrow canal boat floats across a long iron trough high above the valley, with water beneath it, air beside it, and the River Dee far below. Completed in 1805, the aqueduct was designed by Thomas Telford and William Jessup as part of the canal network built for the industrial age. It is about 307 meters long, just over 1,000 feet, and rises around 38 meters, or 126 feet, above the valley. For its time, it was a remarkable piece of engineering. A cast iron water channel carried on tall stone pillars, but the human detail is what makes it memorable. Horses once pulled narrow boats along canals like this, moving limestone, coal, iron, and goods through a country where roads were slow and difficult. Today, people cross it slowly by boat or on foot, often with nothing but a railing on one side and open air on the other. It is not a ruin. It still works. And after this man-made river in the sky, the journey turns inland toward water on a much larger scale. Elan Valley looks natural at first glance. Open hills, dark water, stone dams, and roads that curve quietly around the reservoirs. But this landscape was reshaped for one very practical reason: to send clean water to a growing industrial city more than 110 kilometers, almost 70 miles away. In the late 19th century, Birmingham needed a safer water supply. The answer was found here in mid-Wales, where valleys could be dammed and rainfall collected. Work began in the 1890s, and thousands of laborers arrived to build dams, tunnels, railways, workshops, and even a temporary village for the workforce. That is what makes Elan Valley more than a pretty place. Behind the calm water is a human story of engineering, labor, and sacrifice. Stone farmhouses disappeared. Old valley routes were changed. Land that once supported small rural communities became part of a vast water system. Today, the dams themselves are part of the drama. After heavy rain, water spills over their stone faces in white sheets, turning practical engineering into one of the most striking sights in inland Wales. But after a landscape built to serve distant cities, the journey turns toward a town where a very different kind of resource became famous. Hay-on-Wye is small, but it changed the way people think about what a town can become. Sitting near the border between Wales and England, it became famous not for a castle, a mountain, or a coastline, but for books. In the 1960s, bookseller Richard Booth began filling the town with secondhand bookshops. Old buildings became stores. Shelves appeared in unexpected corners. Hay became known as the world's first major book town, a place where people traveled not just to buy books, but to wander through them. The story became even stranger in 1977 when Booth declared Hay an independent kingdom as a publicity stunt and named himself king. It sounds absurd, but it worked. It gave the town a personality. Clever, eccentric, slightly rebellious, and impossible to confuse with anywhere else. Today, Hay is also known for its literary festival, which brings writers, thinkers, and visitors from around the world. Brecon Beacons National Park, now officially called Bannau Brycheiniog, shows another side of Wales, wide, open, and exposed to the weather. This is a landscape of grassy ridges, waterfalls, caves, old market towns, and high ground where walkers quickly learn that distance on a map can feel very different under wind and rain. Its highest summit is Pembrokeshire, rising 886 meters, about 2,907 feet. It is not as high as the mountains of the north, but it is one of the most climbed peaks in southern Britain because the reward comes fast. Broad views, steep slopes, and the feeling of standing above much of South Wales. But the park is not only for hikers. Its limestone country hides caves and underground rivers, while places like Waterfall Country show how water has cut deep paths through rock. The area also has military importance. Parts of the national park have long been used for tough training exercises, where soldiers face long marches, heavy packs, and unpredictable conditions. That gives the landscape a sharper edge. It is beautiful, but it tests people. Three Cliffs Bay is one of the first places on the south coast where Wales proves that its beaches are not just soft sand and summer views. The bay is named for the three sharp limestone cliffs that rise above the shore, creating one of the most recognizable coastal shapes in the country. But the drama here is not only visual. The beach changes with the tide. At low tide, the sand opens wide and the bay feels enormous. At higher tide, parts of the shore can become cut off, which is why visitors have to pay attention to the water, not just the view. Above the bay stand the ruins of Pembroke Castle, built on high ground overlooking the sand and dunes. Local legend says it was ruined by fairies after the lord of the castle offended them during a celebration. The real story is probably less magical. Wind-blown sand and shifting dunes made this area difficult to live with. That is what makes Three Cliffs Bay memorable. It is beautiful, but it also feels unstable, shaped by tide, wind, erosion, and old stories. Rhossili Bay is often described as one of the finest beaches in Britain, and the reason is obvious as soon as the coastline opens. The beach runs for about 4.8 kilometers, almost 3 miles, with a long curve of sand backed by cliffs, fields, and walking paths high above the water. But Rhossili is not just a place to admire from a viewpoint. It has layers. At low tide, the remains of the Helvetia, a ship wrecked here in 1887, can still be seen in the sand. At the far end of the headland lies Worm's Head, a tidal island reached only when the sea allows it. Miss the safe crossing time, and visitors can be stranded until the tide drops again. That detail gives Rhossili its edge. It may look peaceful, but this coast is ruled by timing. The tide decides where people can walk, how far they can go, and when they have to turn back. Beyond this wide bay, the coast grows longer, wilder, and more broken, leading into one of Britain's great protected shorelines. Pembrokeshire Coast National Park is unusual because it is the only national park in the United Kingdom created mainly for its coastline. It protects a landscape where cliffs, beaches, sea caves, small harbors, islands, and farming communities all sit close together, shaped by the Atlantic. The park covers about 629 square kilometers, roughly 243 square miles, but its real power comes from the coast. The Pembrokeshire Coast Path runs for about 299 kilometers, around 186 miles, following cliffs, coves, beaches, and headlands. For walkers, it is not one single view, but a changing sequence of sea arches, storm beaches, wildflowers, and villages where boats still matter. Wildlife is one of the main reasons this coast feels so alive. Gray seals breed along remote beaches and rocky coves. Porpoises and dolphins are sometimes seen offshore. Seabirds gather on cliffs and islands during the nesting season, turning the sea edge into a moving, noisy landscape. But people have lived with this coast for centuries too, fishing, farming, guiding ships, and watching the weather because the sea could feed a family or destroy a boat. And just offshore, one island will bring that wild side of Wales even closer. Skomer Island lies just off the Pembrokeshire coast, reached by boat when weather and sea conditions allow. And the moment visitors arrive, the island feels less like a tourist stop and more like a working wildlife colony. Puffins walk across the grass with beaks full of sand eels. Guillemots and razorbills crowd the cliff ledges. Gulls call overhead. And beneath the surface, many of the birds are living in burrows rather than nests. The most remarkable story begins after dark. Skomer is famous for Manx shearwaters, seabirds that spend much of their lives far out at sea. At night, they return to the island in huge numbers, calling in the darkness and scrambling back to their burrows to avoid predators. That detail changes the way you see the island. By day, it is cliffs, flowers, puffins, and sea views. By night, it becomes a hidden city of birds. This is Wales at its wildest edge, not empty, but crowded with life most visitors never see. Pembroke Castle is one of the great stone fortresses of Wales, but its most famous story is not only about battle. It is about a baby born inside its walls who would later change the history of England. That child was Henry Tudor, born here in 1457. He later became Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty, after defeating Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. So this Welsh castle is directly tied to one of the most famous turning points in British history. The castle itself stands on a rocky ridge beside the River Cleddau, with water protecting much of its position. Its huge round keep rises about 23 meters, roughly 75 feet, and beneath the castle is Wogan Cavern, a natural limestone cave that was incorporated into the defenses. For medieval people, this was not a romantic ruin. It was a place of soldiers, storage rooms, prisoners, servants, fires, horses, and fear. Castles like this controlled land because people had to pass near them, trade near them, and answer to whoever held them. Tenby is one of the most recognizable seaside towns in Wales, but it is not just a pretty harbor with pastel-colored houses. In the Middle Ages, Tenby was a defended port. Its stone town walls still survive in places, a reminder that coastal beauty also needed protection. Ships came and went, fish were landed, and the town looked outward toward the sea for trade, food, and danger. Later, Tenby became fashionable as a seaside resort, especially in the Georgian and Victorian periods. That is why the town has such a distinctive look today. Colorful houses above the harbor, narrow lanes, beaches wrapped around the old center, and boats leaving for nearby islands when conditions are right. One of the strongest views is across to St. Catherine's Island, where a 19th century fort sits above the water. At low tide, the island feels almost connected to the town. At high tide, the sea takes it back. Cardiff Castle is one of the best places to understand how many layers Wales carries in one place. From the outside, it looks like a medieval fortress in the middle of a modern capital, but its story goes much further back. The Romans built a fort here nearly 2,000 years ago, guarding an important position near the coast. Centuries later, the Normans added a motte and bailey castle, and the stone keep still rises above the grounds today. But the strangest layer came in the 19th century, when the wealthy Bute family transformed parts of the castle into lavish Gothic interiors with the architect William Burgess. That contrast is what makes Cardiff Castle so memorable. One side contains Roman walls, Norman defenses, Victorian fantasy rooms, and even wartime tunnels. During the Second World War, thousands of people sheltered inside the castle walls during air raids, turning this historic monument into a place of real fear and survival. Castell Coch means red castle, and at first glance it looks like something from a fairy tale. Turrets rise above the trees, the walls glow warm against the forest, and the whole place feels older than it really is. But that is the trick. There was a medieval castle here, but the building visitors see today was largely rebuilt in the 19th century for the third Marquis of Bute, one of the richest men in Britain at the time. He worked again with architect William Burgess, the same creative mind behind Cardiff Castle's extraordinary interiors. Together, they turned the ruins into a Gothic revival dream, not a practical fortress, but a romantic vision of the Middle Ages. Tintern Abbey is a different kind of Welsh landmark. It does not dominate the landscape like a castle, and it was not built to frighten enemies. It was built for monks. Founded in 1131, Tintern was one of the great Cistercian abbeys of Britain. The monks who lived here followed a life of prayer, labor, discipline, and routine. Their days were shaped by bells, services, farming, reading, and silence. For centuries, this valley was not a tourist view. It was a working religious community. Then came the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII in the 16th century. The abbey was closed, its valuables removed, and its roof eventually disappeared. What remains today are the soaring stone walls, empty windows, and open sky where the church once stood. That is why Tintern is so powerful. It is beautiful, but its beauty comes from loss. Wales may be small on the map, but it carries a much larger story. Its mountains, castles, coastlines, villages, language, and legends reveal a side of Britain many visitors never truly know. Once you have seen Wales properly, Britain never looks quite the same again.